Hey everybody, it's Tim from Tadabase here, and this is Build It with Tim. On today's episode, we're going to be dealing with some external APIs using Tadabase pipes. Specifically, we're going to be talking about APIs that require a token as a form of authorization, and they require that token to be refreshed after a certain amount of time. Now, for this example, we're going to be dealing with Octoparse, which is a really great tool for scraping websites and extracting data. So we're going to build a custom pipe to support this. And I'm going to show you just the technique specifically for how to get a token in the first place, and then how to send a refresh request in order to get a new token. Jumping into the builder here, we're going to talk a little bit about the setup in Octoparse specifically. Now, this is just an example using this specific service, but so a lot of the context is going to be kind of aimed around that, but it's not really the point. So the point here is going to be how we're actually dealing with the pipe itself, the custom pipe, and then building in some automations to do things in the background, such as refreshing that token. So for Octoparse specifically, what we've done is I've built a task in Octoparse that's going to scrape a website to get announcement posts. And we're going to extract that data on a schedule. So say once a day. Okay, so in this application here, I've created a standalone table, a separate table called Octoparse Web Scraping Tasks. And in here, I've stored the task ID that comes from Octoparse. Now, again, I'm not really going to get into that because it's not super relevant for the whole entire topic of this video. But that's kind of the basic setup here, is that I'm storing a task ID and I want to trigger this task via API with my Tadabase application. And per that specific request, we need to pass a task ID. But before we do that, we need to actually get authenticated by requesting a token and then making sure that that token stays alive, meaning it does not expire in the set expiration time. So we'll come back to the data builder here in a moment, but let's set up our custom pipe first. We'll click on Add Custom Pipe, and this will give us an opportunity to define whatever we want as our pipe. We're going to call it Octoparse, and then I'm going to start adding some API calls. I'm going to add 3 calls because there's 3 things I want to do here. Number 1 is obtain the token the first time. Number 2 is the specific request to keep that token alive. And then number 3 is going to be to start our task using the data from that task data table. So for the first one, we'll call this get token. The second one, we'll call this refresh token. The third one we'll call start task. All right, now we'll focus on the top one for now. I know how we're building this is obviously very dependent on the API that you're trying to connect to. So I'm going to be pasting in some values that are specific to Octoparse. But again, that's not really the point. The point here is how you can then trigger these tasks in order to meet your objective. Now, to get a token from this specific provider, we need to send a post request to this endpoint. They require a content type header of application/JSON. And in the request, we are going to send a raw JSON request. In this request, we are going to pass our username, our password, and a grant type. Again, this is specific to Octoparse, and it's likely going to be very different for you. You can see when I go to the test tab and hit test, we are going to get a response from Octoparse, including our access token, how many seconds it expires in, which 86,400 seconds is 24 hours, the token type of bearer, and our refresh token. We need to make sure that we save the access token and the refresh token from this response. These 2 things are going to be very important to us because we need to send the access token to authenticate ourselves for subsequent API requests. And we need to save the refresh token because that's required in the refresh token request. In order to save these, we're simply going to scroll down a bit and hit populate responses. And we will just save the 2 that I mentioned here, which is the access token and the refresh token. Click populate, and now we have our responses mapped and saved. Now, while we're here, we're going to continue to build out the refresh token request, and then we'll go back to the data builder in the automation tab in order to learn how to actually trigger these things in conjunction with one another. This is going to be another post request to the same endpoint. But this time around, we're actually going to send a slightly different request. For this one, I'm going to set up a parameter here, and I'm going to call this refresh underscore token. Um, and that way we can fill this dynamically because we are going to save that value from the first get token request. We're going to save it to a data table. We're going to save it to a record. And we want to be able to then feed that data dynamically as a parameter to the refresh token request. For headers, we need to do content type and application slash JSON again. For our request, we're going to do raw request and JSON. And our request is going to look like this. Again, this is specific to Octoparse. So your experience with your request and what you are required to pass to your external API is entirely dependent on what you're using. Now, headed to the test tab, if I go back here and I grab this refresh token and then use it in this request, it's going to provide us with a brand new access token. And again, another refresh token that we need to save, which it looks like this might actually be the same refresh token, but that's all fine and good. We can save it back to our app anyways. So we're going to populate this again, just like we did before, where we are saving that access token and the refresh token. Basically, every time these two things are triggered, we're going to save those values back to a record. Now, for our final request here, where we're trying to actually send an API request to Octoparse to actually do something now. The first two requests that we sent are simply just to get our token, and then we're going to just refresh that token as needed. But when we actually want to start dealing with data, this is going to be the request that we're actually going to use. And I'll show you how to set that up now. We're going to send a post request to this particular endpoint, and we're going to build out a parameter just like we did in the last one for task ID. And additionally, one more parameter that we're actually going to pass to the headers tab rather than the request tab. The first two requests, the ones that deal with tokens, the token needs to be passed in a header, not in the request. It needs to be passed as authorization for the header. So we're going to build two parameters, like I said. One, the task ID is going to be for our request so that Octoparse knows which task we want to trigger. But then the second one, which I'm going to call access underscore token, this one is actually going to be passed to the header. Inside the headers tab, we'll add our first one, which is going to be the content type once again. The second one is going to look like this. The key is authorization, and the value is bearer space, and then our parameter of access token. Wrapping it in the curly braces means that it's going to accept a dynamic value. For our request tab here, we're going to do the same thing of setting a raw request type, and the content type is JSON. And we are going to pass in this particular request. And you'll notice here that I have one parameter. Again, I'm sending the task ID, which goes to the body. The other parameter, access token, goes to the header. But now, when I actually go and test this with a task ID, again, this will come from a record value later, but for now, I'm just going to enter it manually, and I'm going to paste in the access token that came from my previous request. Clicking test will show me null, which is fine, and the request ID. So this was a successful test. You can see status code 200 indicates it was successful. So we're good to go. I'm simply going to take just the request ID because, again, with something like Octoparse, once this task is finished, I could then pass this request ID to go fetch the data that it actually scraped from my website. So that's our custom pipe all set up with three different requests. Now, the last one is simply just to show you kind of the practical use case of this, but the first two is really the point of the video, the get the token and refresh the token. So now we'll talk about how we can actually build that into our application so that you can basically set it and forget it. Before we set up the automation itself, we need to add a couple things to this data table. We're storing our task ID, which is fine. That works for our third request there in our pipe. But we also want to make sure that we are storing the access token and the refresh token. I'm going to create a long text field to store the access token because of the amount of characters that are actually returned for that token. I think we would max out the text or potentially max out the text field. So I'm just going to use a long text just to be safe. And the refresh token was much shorter, so I'm going to use a regular text field for that. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to set up a table rule that says every time a record is created, we are going to get a token. We're going to add our pipe and we're going to choose octoparse get token. There are no parameters that we need to pass for this. All we need to do is set the record value of access token to the pipe response of the access token. And we also need to set refresh token to a pipe response of the refresh token. Now, just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to set this to created or edited because I actually want to trigger this simply by opening up the record and saving it. You can see that our two fields are now filled with our access token and our refresh token. Now, this is important because we're going to use this for the next step. Under the automation tab, we're going to set up a scheduled task, and this is going to be the refresh token function. So we are going to select the octoparse tasks table, and we're going to run this on a schedule to say every day, because we need to refresh this every 24 hours, we are going to say run this every day at whatever time you want. So let's say this wants to be, let's do like right at midnight, 12 a.m. And our action is going to be to update the record, trigger the pipe using the refresh token method. We are going to set our parameters where we're going to pass a value from our data table to the refresh token parameter. And that record value that we're going to pass is our refresh token. And then once again, we are going to set our access token and our refresh token to the pipe responses of access token and refresh token. So what's happening now is that every single time we are adding a record into this application of the task that we want to trigger through Octoparse, then that's the first request that we are sending. We are getting our token at that point. This means that every time a record is created here, you're going to have an access token and a refresh token, and you never have to worry about kind of how the records are being created because we set it up as a table rule. This will trigger all the time. Now that we have these values stored inside of a data table, now we can simply just set up an automated task to process those values every single day at midnight by sending the request to actually refresh the token and make sure that every time we come back to that table and we want to actually start an octoparse task, we have a current non-expired access token. There's a number of different ways that you can do this. I'm simply showing you one method, which is probably the most reliable, I would think, is setting up a scheduled task to just run this process in the background. Keep that token alive. It will never expire at that point. You'll always have a new token to deal with, and you'll always have that token stored in the place where we actually need to pass it from, which is inside this particular table where we are trying to deal with this particular piece of data. All right, so I hope that helps you with how to deal with token authorization, specifically tokens that expire, and how to refresh that token for continued authorization for subsequent API requests. And every external API is going to be different. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to our support team. We'd be happy to shed some light or give you some guidance on how to proceed. All right, so thanks so much for watching this week's episode of Build It with Tim. We'll see you next time. Take care.